Welcome to Her Story, the history of Southeast Asia told from her perspective. We'll discover historical figures, matriarchal societies, and contemporary female icons, and maybe learn about ourselves along the way. I'm your host, Agas Ramirez. Today, we're talking about the often overlooked history of female immigrants in colonial Malaya spanning from the late 19th to mid 20th century. These women, primarily from Indian and Chinese communities, played vital roles in tin mining, rubber plantations, urban domestic work, and more. Despite their contributions, their narratives have been sidelined, reduced to footnotes in male dominated accounts of migration. The history of women is less highlighted because it assumes that the role and life of women do not change, but it's a static factor in social development. Shamala Nair Gopal and Mahani Musa. Women's contributions to history are often overshadowed, and colonial Malaya is no exception. Today, we're looking at the stories of Indian and Chinese women whose labor and resilience helped shape Malaya's economy and society during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. From the grueling work on rubber plantations and tin mines to their roles in domestic service and family life, these women's stories reveal a rich narrative of migration, exploitation, and survival. Why focus on these women? In past episodes, we usually have one or two central female figures, with the exception of the Minangkabau Matriarchal Society, for example, the Nyai of the Dutch East Indies, and so on. Here, we're looking at a broad and often anonymous group of women because understanding their lives challenges the outdated notion that women in history were merely passive figures. We've talked about this a bit in the previous episode with the women of the Philippine Revolution. Again, it keeps coming up, the supporting role. But these women weren't just supporting characters in the colonial economy, they were central to its success. By highlighting their experiences, we aim to bring their labor and resilience into focus, reshaping how we view colonial migration and labor systems. This isn't going to be a very deep dive. This is a broad topic, and you can consider this an introduction. Throughout this episode, you'll hear us use the term coolie in reference to historical labor systems. This term, while widely used in colonial era records, is now considered derogatory. This is because it's associated with exploitation and discrimination. According to Arunima data, there are various claimed origins for the term coolie. The most common in Malayan history is that it might have come from the Tamil word hulia. This means a person of lower caste who performed menial work. This makes sense because the majority of rubber estate coolies in colonial Malaya were Tamils, both men and women. However, coolie more often refers to men, rendering women a little more invisible in the colonial economy. Now that you and I are aware of the term's loaded history, we use it in this episode with sensitivity and respect. You'll hear the term in some quotes from the sources we're referencing. Remember, we are only using it to accurately reflect the historical context of labor migration. Now let's set the scene and talk about migration in colonial Malaya. Malaya became a crucial maritime link between the West and the East with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. That's when it really started to become a valued British colony. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Malaya was undergoing a rapid economic transformation. Tin mining, rubber plantations, and infrastructure projects such as railways and roads were expanding quickly, creating a very high demand for labor. Colonial administrators and industry leaders turned to India and China to meet this need for labor, recruiting millions of migrants to sustain the booming economy. Without these workers, industries like tin and rubber would not have developed as they did. The reasons for migration were deeply rooted in the economic and social challenges of the migrants' homelands. In South India, poverty, famine, and limited job opportunities pushed entire families to seek a better life abroad. For many, migration represented an escape from dire circumstances. By the early 1900s, Indian women began migrating alongside men, often as part of family groups. However, not all migrations were tied to families. Many women traveled alone, driven by personal struggles and the hope for independence. As historian Aruni Madata explains, women migrated as wives of coolie men, but others migrated alone to escape abusive marriages, family quarrels, or lives as widows or prostitutes. This migration wasn't solely about economic survival. It reflected broader structural inequalities and the personal resilience of women seeking new opportunities. These women were not passive participants in colonial labor systems. Their journeys tell stories of agency, survival, and the complex realities of life in British Malaya. For Indian women, rubber plantations were the central site of their labor. These women took on physically demanding roles as tappers, collecting latex from rubber trees, and as weeders, maintaining the growth and productivity of the plantations. Their labor was essential to the operation of the rubber industry, which became one of Malaya's most profitable colonial enterprises. Despite their critical contributions, Indian women were paid significantly less than the men for performing the same tasks. Bet you've never heard that one before. This stark gendered wage gap reflects the broader societal norms and economic systems that undervalued women's work, particularly in the colonial context. The plantation system perpetuated these disparities, treating women as secondary earners while relying heavily on their labor. As Sharon M. Lee aptly describes it, women's labor was central to maintaining these key colonial industries. Shamala Nair Gopal and Mahani Musa further emphasize the plantation system thrived on the cheap labor of Indian women whose economic exploitation was justified by colonial and patriarchal ideologies. Despite these systemic inequalities, these women's work was indispensable not only for the economic success of the plantations, but also for the survival of their families and communities. Their resilience in the face of exploitation highlights the complexities of their lived experiences, contributing to Malaya's prosperity while bearing the brunt of systemic oppression. Chinese women, on the other hand, played a crucial role in Malaya's tin mining industry, particularly during times of economic crisis. They took on demanding tasks like dulang washing, a labor-intensive process that involved sifting through sediment to extract tin deposits. This work was physically exhausting and required long hours in harsh conditions. During economic downturns, such as the Great Depression of the 1930s, women became indispensable, stepping in as a reserve army of casual labor to keep the tin industry afloat. Despite their essential contributions, Chinese women in tin mining were paid significantly less than the men and were subjected to the same grueling conditions. Their willingness to take on this work ensured the survival of one of Malaya's most important industries, highlighting both their resilience and the systemic exploitation they faced. This dynamic underscores how women's labor was both integral and undervalued in Malaya's colonial economy. By the 1930s, too, Chinese women increasingly took on roles as domestic workers in Malaya's urban centers, becoming the backbone of household labor. Their duties typically included cleaning, cooking, and childcare, which were seen as extensions of traditional gender roles. While this work provided a degree of stability and financial security, it also reinforced dependency and limited opportunities for upward mobility. One remarkable aspect of Chinese women in domestic service was the formation of tight-knit sisterhood communities. These networks offered support, solidarity, and a sense of belonging, helping women navigate the challenges of isolation and exploitation in urban environments. If this topic interests you, be sure to check out episode 21 of this podcast, The Black and White Amas of Penang, which delves deeper into the lives of these remarkable women. From their migration stories to their professional reputations as skilled domestic workers, the Amas exemplify the resilience and adaptability of Chinese women migrants during this era. Now, in colonial Malaya, the labor migration system heavily prioritized men, with industries like tin mining and rubber plantations recruiting primarily male workers. This created a stark gender imbalance, which had profound social consequences, one of the most troubling being the increased demand for female labor in prostitution. With far more men than women in these colonial economies, sex work became a way to commodify women's bodies, framing their labor as a necessity to support male workers. As Lee explains, the dominance of males in temporary labor migration created a demand for female labor in prostitution, an often coerced form of work, meaning many women found themselves tricked or forced into prostitution. Often, this was done through systemic exploitation by labor recruiters or criminal networks. For some, poverty and limited opportunities left little choice but to enter this line of work. Others were trafficked under false pretenses, lured by promises of legitimate employment or better wages. I wish I could say this doesn't happen anymore, but this is still the reality today. The colonial administration then played a complicit role in these practices, turning a blind eye to exploitation while regulating prostitution through licensing and mandatory medical checks for sex workers. This is very similar to that episode we did on sex trafficking in French Indochina. It's all the same story everywhere. This approach prioritized economic productivity and maintaining social order over justice for the women involved. Rather than addressing the inequalities that created these conditions, authorities saw the satisfaction of male workers as essential to reducing unrest and sustaining labor systems. This commodification of women's labor, both physical and sexual, exemplifies the darker realities of colonial economies where exploitation was deeply ingrained and perpetuated by those in power. Here's an interesting tangent I found in one of the readings. It talks about morality in the colonial state. The colonial administration in Malaya often imposed moral judgments on Indian women. British colonial authorities viewed Indian women's lives through the lens of Victorian morality, attempting to regulate their behavior, marriages, and family dynamics to align with British ideals. As the historian Arunima Datta observes, colonial administrators tried to impose British morality standards, family ideals, and marital laws without considering the unique social dynamics in immigrant coolie communities. This approach ignored the realities of plantation life, where women were often subjected to exploitation and neglect. For example, on October 22, 1908, the Parak pioneer reported a murder case. Quote, "Of all the races living under the sun, the Low Tamil is perhaps the most immoral. For fury and ungovernable jealousy he beats all others. The latest in the case comes from Ipoh, where a Tamil hacked his wife to death. The deceased, who was but 18, told her husband that she was tired of him and would seek another protector. It may have been an idle threat, made perhaps to secure a new raukai or partner, but it set the fire ablaze in the heart of her jealous husband, and losing all control over himself, I'm not going to tell you the rest. It's a little too gruesome for this show, but you get the idea. Data gives several accounts of instances where women tried to leave their husbands to stay with either their relatives or new partners, but they would end up being severely injured or murdered. Then the British would have trouble prosecuting such crimes. One issue was the lack of documentation for marriages, and another was cultural nuances in general. This topic is fairly complex. I'm not sure I understand it myself. But essentially, colonial authorities gave out arbitrary punishments, and people often felt a lot was being ignored or justice wasn't being served. To avoid accepting responsibility and, making and enforcing laws, they stereotyped violent and immoral behavior as an inherent trait of Indian coolies. Ironically, Indian nationalist leaders critiqued the colonial government's treatment of women while perpetuating patriarchal norms within their own movements. Figures like M.K. Gandhi used the struggles of Indian coolie women in overseas colonies as rallying points to unite nationalists against British rule. As Datta notes, The morality issues of Indian coolie women in overseas colonies were M.K. Gandhi's initial motivation to assemble Indian nationalists and protest against the colonial government. However, these efforts often centered on preserving women's honor rather than addressing the root causes of their exploitation. This duality highlights how women's struggles were frequently politicized, with their voices sidelined in both colonial and nationalist narratives. For more on this, read Arunima Datta's 2016 article on Indian coolie women. With many Indian men conscripted into forced labor or displaced by the war, women were left to shoulder the burden of managing plantations and carrying. With many Indian men conscripted into forced labor or displaced by the war, women were left to shoulder the burden of managing plantations and caring for their families under even harsher conditions. These women faced heightened violence, food shortages, and exploitation by Japanese forces, further compounding the struggles they endured during the colonial period. Despite these challenges, the war also presented Indian women with unique opportunities to assert independence and take on new roles. Many became active participants in nationalist movements, most notably joining the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, an all-women's military unit of the Indian National Army. This regiment trained women in combat, medical aid, and organizational leadership, giving them a newfound sense of political and personal agency. As Datta notes, the war years were marked by immense hardship for Indian women, yet they also provided a unique opportunity for them to join resistance movements. Through their participation in the Rani of Jhansi Regiment and other nationalist efforts, Indian women in Malaya challenged traditional gender roles and redefined their place in both the nationalist struggle and their communities. We are definitely going to do an episode on the Rani of the Jhansi Regiment. It's a fascinating story, and Captain Lakshmi Swaminathan will blow you away. While the war underscored their resilience in the face of adversity, it also marked a turning point, allowing these women to transition from the margins of society to active contributors in shaping the course of history. The stories of Indian and Chinese women migrants in colonial Malaya reveal a legacy of extraordinary resilience. These women shaped Malaya's economy and society through their labor in plantations, mines, domestic service, and even in roles of political resistance. Despite economic exploitation and marginalization, they built communities, supported families, and contributed to industries that were essential to the colony's prosperity. Their perseverance in the face of immense hardships challenges the narrative that often reduced them to passive victims. Recognizing these stories not only reframes how we understand colonial economies, but also honors the agency and strength of these women. As Datta reminds us, coolie women living in extremely oppressive conditions were agential in their multifarious relations within colonial estate societies. What Datta means, in simple language, is that even though coolie women lived in harsh and oppressive conditions, they still found ways to make choices and take control of their lives in small but meaningful ways. They weren't just helpless victims, they actively navigated their relationships and situations on the plantations to improve their circumstances, even if their actions didn't challenge the system outright. Lee adds, quote, "The neglect of female immigrants' economic role perpetuates a partial and skewed historical narrative." Unquote. By amplifying these voices, we confront the erasures of history and shine a light on the often overlooked contributions of women who shaped the social and economic fabric of colonial Malaya. So that said, we are thankful to scholars like Sharon M. Lee, Arunima Datta, Shamala Nair Gopal, and Mahani Musa. Their research ensures that these stories are not forgotten and continues to inspire us to think critically about the past. Thank you for listening to episode 29, Labor at the Margins, Indian and Chinese Women Migrants in British Malaya. There is actually a lot more to talk about, so consider subscribing. Shout out to our patrons, Shereen, Geraineon, Xiaomei by Milish, Jennifer, Christina, Raymond, Matt, Ashley, Chanda, Yati, and our newest member, Christopher. Head on over to Patreon right now to listen to 9 bonus episodes, including Ying, Taphan and the Krom Klone, The Rise and Fall of the Acehnese Queens, 1641 to 1699, and Editors at Large, Ludu, Amar, and Malaya. Along with the bonus episodes, you get access to full scripts and reference materials, and you can also send me a message if you have comments or questions. The last episode of Season 2 is coming out shortly, so please stay tuned. It's going to be about Salud Algabre, a prominent member of the Sacdalista movement, a Filipino peasant organization founded in 1930 to oppose American colonialism and the ruling elites in the Philippines. I'm really looking forward to it, and I know you're going to enjoy this one. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Threads, and Instagram at Her Story Say Pod. That's Her Story, SEA Pod. This podcast was hosted and edited by Agas Ramirez. Maraming salamat.